fiscal stimulus. But people couldn't spend any of this money, of course. The whole point was stay home. And so the saving rates soared to the highest rates we ever had, to 25% personal saving rates, for example, until the economy began to be opened up. So the first impulse of the money was to boost stock market prices and Bitcoin prices and tokens prices. We had a huge rise of every asset price possible. And then within a year, the monetary mechanism pushed it into commodities, and within 2 years into the mainstream economy. So this was a supply shock met by an overreaction to the shock, because it was a big overcompensation. And the Fed went overboard not to make sure there was no financial crisis like 2008 by flooding the economy with liquidity. And that's the first roots of what we're experiencing right now. There definitely are monetary roots. But then, of course, came, on top of all of this, the war. And just a word about the war. In my view, the war could have been avoided at the end of 2021, and it could have been stopped in March 2022. The issue, to my mind, all along is NATO enlargement as the central issue here. Putin has said since the Bucharest NATO summit of 2008, don't do that. Don't you come up to our borders in Ukraine, much less Georgia. And of course, George Bush, as part of this vision that I learned about the hard way 30 years ago, was pushing the US vision of a unipolar world with NATO everywhere. You know, the first wave of NATO, which was Czech Republic, and Poland in 1999, was opposed by Russia and contrary to the promise, but not violently opposed, I would say. I think the Russians were very frustrated, but this was Central Europe. This was far from the borders. This wasn't any kind of direct military threat. Maybe it was a cheat on what the promises were, but it wasn't a direct threat. It happened. But under George W. Bush Jr., there were 7 more NATO enlargements, and those were close to home. The 3 Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, and Slovakia. But the real clincher, in my mind, was the 2008 Bucharest summit, where Bush said, we will expand to Ukraine and to Georgia. Because if you look at a map, that means surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And it means Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Georgia, completely surrounding Russia in its basic outlet to not only the Black Sea, but to the Eastern Mediterranean. And to my mind, it was like the first Crimean War, which was exactly the intent of Palmerston and Napoleon III, take Russia out of the Black Sea. And this is the second Crimean War, in my view, in the same way. A kind of, I call it neoconservative madness of the United States, unwilling to hear the concern of the other side at all. So in December 2021, Putin made a last attempt. 3 conditions put on the table. Crimea remains Russian. The Minsk II agreement is implemented, and NATO not enlarged. And Biden brushed them all aside, said we're not negotiating over any of that. And then the war The invasion came on February 24th of this year. Clearly, the idea of the first phase of the war was to shock the Zelensky government into negotiating. And indeed, in mid-March, the Ukrainians gave the Russians a piece of paper which said, we will agree to neutrality and will agree to put the issues of the Donbass and Crimea down the road. And on that basis, Putin said, draft an agreement, and the Turkish mediators were close to an agreement, and then Ukraine walked out of the negotiations at the end of March. I don't know why, but I suspect because the US told them to. I don't know for sure. But suddenly the Ukrainians said to the Turks, we're not negotiating anymore, we're putting a pause to the negotiations. And Zelensky's new position, which was radically different from March, was we will only negotiate after Russia is kicked out of every square meter of Ukraine, including Crimea. Good luck on that one. And we've been in the war since then. So this is obviously the second huge shock. And the US thought that kicking Russia out of SWIFT and confiscating $300 billion of foreign exchange reserves would crush the Russian economy, and that the world would side with the US on this. And the reality has turned out to be quite different, which is that probably the Russian economy is still functioning okay, I would say, maybe not. I'd love to hear the views here. I think okay. The exports have continued at a somewhat diminished level, but have continued to China and especially India and to the East. And diplomatically, the US, Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore are the team, but the rest of the world says, please don't get us involved. And so it's quite different from a world opposed to Russia. It's really the EU, UK, US, and a few countries in Asia opposed to Russia. And of course, the most enthusiastic country of all, even more than the United States, is the United Kingdom. They just love this because this really is the second Crimean War for them, and they're so excited.